Author and editor Karen Dosanjh is in studio with us. Karen leads the global marketing efforts for OSI Digital, which is a leading provider of business and technology solutions for Fortune 500 companies around the world. For Karen, preserving pioneer voices for future generations is a passion project, which began in 2006 when she helped her family document their forefather, Babaji Gyan Singh Johal's 100-year celebration in Canada. She partnered with leading publications like Aaj Magazine, Vancouver Sun, and The Province to bring South Asian history to light for the broader community here in BC. I'm very honored to have her here with us right now. Good evening, Karen. How are you doing?
I'm great. What a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. So what first sparked your interest when we look at this story? It is a very unique story that doesn't often get told. So what really sparked your interest to look into the South Asian heritage here in Canada?
Absolutely. It started first with a curiosity about my own family. And you mentioned Babaji Gyan Singh. So I was born into a pioneer family, and I'm also married into a pioneer family in that my husband's grandfather also came to Canada in the early 1900s. My forefather on my side came in 1906, and my husband's in 1907. So I was really curious about whether or not they knew each other, what were the cross connections of the earliest settlers. Mm-hmm. So it started there with wanting to know more about, my own history and my own family's history so that we could pass that knowledge down to our children and have them understand, how far we've come.
And what was that process like for you? Because this is your family. It began with your family, but you're taking an approach as an author and as a curator to tell this story. So what was that process like for you in gathering this information and this history and all of these really historic images as well that are throughout the book? What was that like for you?
Yeah, so when I first started with my own family stories, it was sitting down with family elders and asking the right questions. Mm-hmm. And it was really surprising that, I took the stories to the Vancouver Sun, and they actually put the story of Narayan Singh and Mahakaur on the front page of the newspaper. Wow. And as did Aaj Magazine, Suki Pangalia put both of those stories on back-to-back covers. And the feedback from the community is, we want to hear more of these stories. Mm-hmm. And there's so many families whose stories had not been told. So the project really turned from being almost a bit self-serving to, what I think I can be of service to other families. Mm-hmm. And I have some skills and talents I'm able to share. And that's really where where it turned from me to, how can I do more? And so the idea and the vision for the book came about at that point. And after talking to a lot of great educators that said, we need more of this content. And they were asking me to come speak to schools and to kids who would really benefit from these stories because they too came from immigrant families. And, the kids really needed to hear more positivity and more positive narratives about the South Asian community. And so I was starting to do that. And then the idea for Untold Stories was born then. That, let's start collecting and gathering these stories, and let's get more of these stories out into the community.
And when you were gathering these stories, was there any one particular story that really surprised you or taught you something that you didn't know before?
Absolutely. So I think throughout my writing, the first part of the book really chronicles the historical milestones for South Asians from the very first that arrived in 1897 that came here, as part, there were soldiers, and they saw this beautiful, land of BC, and they heard about all of these opportunities, particularly in the sawmill community, in the agricultural industry, and also on the railways, building the railways. So they went back to Punjab, of course, and they said, there's this amazing place, and there's jobs there for us. And many people followed, primarily South Asian men came in search of those jobs. So just understanding the journey, understanding how challenging it was for them to come. They came here via steamship, if you can imagine, month-long journey, and they were very young, and they came with little or nothing. And they were absolutely not welcomed, here upon arrival. In many cases, it's been documented that there was a lot of, racial injustice that they faced. They were not welcome to certain, restaurants, and they were public. They were assaulted. They really faced a lot of backlash. People thought they were here, taking jobs that were meant for others. In fact, they were paid less than, other non-minority workers. So I learned a lot about what that experience for them was like. And I even uncovered that there was race riots. There was a race riot right here, in Vancouver, BC, where a group called the Asiatic Exclusion League, their whole mission was to keep Japanese, South Asian, and Chinese people out of Canada. And their slogan was called White Canada Forever. So these were things I learned through my process of research. And I had never learned about this in school. I think it's really important that we bring these stories to light so that we don't repeat the mistakes of our past. And I feel really strongly about this. And I think that, it's been really amazing to see educators get behind this book, whether it's, teachers, high school teachers, or even university teachers, because there's such a gap for culturally relevant content. And I think with what's happening with Black Lives Matters, that revolution has really shown that there's a missing link in our classrooms. And, we really hope that Untold Stories can help fill that gap from a South Asian perspective.
And so when you say that, are you hoping that Untold Stories or these histories in general can become part of the curriculum in schools? Because I myself, when I went to school, there was never anything about South Asian history. And currently today, there still isn't. So is that something that is also a priority for you with this book?
That was actually the end game. That was the goal from the beginning is, hey, listen, I have a full-time job, that takes care of me. This is a volunteer passion project. And I donated my time to write this book and to gather these stories. And the reason why is I like to see, the goal is to have this book in every library, in every classroom in BC. That's the goal. And we're working with some amazing teachers, Gurpreet Kaur Baines of L.A. Matheson and Annie Ohana.
Yes, she's been on the show
who
before.
You probably know,
yes.
Have also taken it on, outside of, on their own time to write the teacher's guide. And why that's important is without the teacher's guide, there's no curriculum. So with the teacher's guide, our BC teachers can then create exercises and quizzes and tests around the content of the book. That was the original goal because, it's great to get the books out, but once it gets to youth and, the youth are learning from this and they're benefiting from this and are understanding the challenges that, the earliest settlers faced, what they went through and how they overcame and how the community actually thrived. How can we take that for granted? It's really, really close to my heart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned with the youth, and a lot of the time for second generation, you're kind of battling these two identities of being South Asian, coming from an immigrant family, but also being born and brought up in Canada. And a lot of the time, who you're surrounded by, your friends or the school you go to is very much dominated by that Western culture. So it's difficult to stay true to that, to your roots and to that history that is so important. And is that also a goal for you with this book, is in teaching to second generation South Asians like myself the importance of this history and what their ancestors, their parents have gone through to make a better life for them?
It's a great question. And I also believe that was a common theme throughout the book, because when upon arrival, our first settlers, they weren't allowed to express their culture. The pioneer corps that arrived here were told very implicitly that you are to leave all of your, customary cultural clothing behind. And if they did, in fact, bring them, they had to burn their beautiful saris and dupattas and salwar kameez, because it would not be acceptable to wear that in Canadian society.
Wow.
And I've documented that throughout the book. And, they had to wear dresses. These women had never worn dresses in their life. So they would actually sew their own dresses, and they would try to make them a little bit longer to stay humble because they weren't comfortable showing their legs. They would still want to wear their headscarves as it was, a sign of their Sikh faith. And they would wear their headscarves with their dresses. And there's many beautiful photos of, the very first women who started to arrive, majority of them in the late 1920s. And it's a sense of practical adaptation. They adapted, but, they weren't by any stretch comfortable. This wasn't their attire. So, fast forward to our generation now, when we can celebrate our culture, we can wear our beautiful clothing to work, if we're celebrating Diwali or whatever it is. Like, that is something we should never take for granted, understanding what it was like for the first that came.
For them, were they comfortable in doing this? Did they want to share their story, or did they feel uncomfortable to talk about some of the struggles they faced?
It took a lot of building of trust. These are families that are sharing their precious artifacts, right? They're dusting off, very rare, never seen before images, from their own personal collections. And they're sharing details about their family history. And it really, my approach was to listen, to sit and listen, to ask the right questions. And to be very honest, it was like mining for gold, in terms of, the stories that they would share and the anecdotes that would come out.
Right.
So I interviewed a number of elders, and I was really fortunate to have family members. In some cases, it was their grandchildren or their children who helped, digitize the photos and helped, really. We collected over 1,000 photos for this book, and I wrote over 70,000 words, if you can imagine.
Wow.
And so, it was quite a process and truly a labor of love. But it would not have happened without those content champions that I call, and also the elders who were just, so willing to share their history. And I really encourage others, like, the work shouldn't stop here. There's so much more room for others to tell their stories, whether it's your own grandparents, to sit down or your parents and ask them what their journey was like. It really is a soul-searching experience to listen to the answers.
And how long did that process take you from beginning to end, from knowing that you wanted to write this book to now it being published?
It took a lot longer than I thought it would. It was about a year-long process.
Okay.
And keeping in mind I have a full-time job, and this was very much a voluntary project, but it was wonderful to partner with the Oj Media Group and Suki Pengelia, who, believed in this project from the beginning and backed it. You need somebody to back a project like this, and it was challenging. We really worked through a lot of sort of struggles, and of course, you've COVID right in the middle of all of this that just provided a different lens, I think, to what we were experiencing. It was really quite interesting.
Yeah, and let's touch on that a little bit, because this book, you were writing and producing it in the middle of a global pandemic. So how did that really kind of shape your lens as an author?
So when I was writing it, I thought about, wow, how lucky are we that we don't ever have to worry about these mysterious illnesses that come up, because that was what was happening to people in those times, whether it was the Spanish flu or tuberculosis. I thought, how wonderful is it that we don't have to worry about, jobs and having to hunt for work, or, the groceries or things like that, scarcity of goods. These were challenges that they were facing. And of course, racial discrimination, like all of these issues that our pioneer elders were facing somehow came to light. And it, reminds me of a conversation I had with Cecil Corbanes, who is on the front cover of the book. She's the little girl whose dress is colorized. She's now in her 80s, and she was born and raised here in 1930s. And she said, I grew up during the Great Depression. And, I remember going to the grocery store with my dad, and we knew that goods were scarce. We knew that there were certain things that were not available. So we always made sure that we never took more than we needed. And I just thought how beautiful that is. And then you fast forward and we're seeing, some of the things that we were seeing during COVID. And it just reminded me about the certain elements of human nature that are lost. And I really tried to highlight those in the book, the goodness. And another common theme was, in those days, people didn't just take care of their own children and their own families, they took care of their communities. So as new people were migrating into the country, they would welcome them with open arms. And, I even remember when my brothers and sisters migrated with, my mother. My father had already come earlier. It was my Uncle Minder who would take buses to drive them to take them to school and take buses to bring them back. Those are sort of, poignant moments of looking out for everybody's kids to make sure everybody gets ahead, not just your own.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is a piece that I also want to touch on is women and the fact that their stories are very much untold. And you really focused in on their journeys, and you talked about the experience of marriage and the experience of being a mother and of coming to a new country and what that was like. And I thought that was really interesting to learn about, because you often don't think about that. You don't think about what your mother goes through, because a lot of the times in that time, especially, women weren't working.
Yes.
So potentially they weren't out there doing the agricultural focused jobs like the men were, but they had different struggles. And I think that was really interesting to learn about. So talk to me, why did that really matter to you to share that story?
I think growing up, we are, in our culture, it is very much a patriarchal society. It just is, right? And I think telling these stories and talking to the families, yes, they always talked about, Babaji's experience. And I would ask the question, well, where was BBG in all of this, right? And they would say, well, she was back home, so we don't really know really well what was she doing. And it would, come out that, well, she was looking after the children back home, while their father came here for the job, and she was looking after the elders and all of that, and huge contributions. So I really wanted to highlight that, and I think that in many cases the South Asian men that migrated were somewhat heroes, right? Because they came to this new country, and the women who were left behind didn't necessarily have the same status, but they experienced great struggles. So I really tried to tell that story of the pioneer corps. And then what it was like when they did come. Now, of course, these families were separated for many years. The Canadian government had implemented a law called the Continuous Journey Regulation. So the very first, men that came, and essentially the door was closed behind them. And the law was actually excluded people coming from a direct, if they didn't come from a direct port, they weren't allowed into the country. Now, we know now that there were no ships that were coming direct from India at that time. So it really kind of hindered the migration of South Asians. And it reflected a lot of the sentiment of people at the time. If you look at newspaper clippings, and a lot of this is documented in the book, the migration of South Asians was called, invasion, words like that, hordes of these people coming. And it's really difficult, but these are documented. This is very factual, and I think the Canadian government does take a lot of responsibility for those actions, and at the same time, they're openly welcoming people from European countries, and there was in fact a head tax put on people coming from South Asian countries. So there is a lot to be learned, and I think what's fantastic is we've seen a lot of documentation around the Kamagata Maru, but there's a lot more left to uncover and left to discover about the early treatment of the South Asian people.
Yeah, and I think something about your book that is really unique is the fact that it's all in English. And there are other books about South Asian heritage, but largely they're in Punjabi. And so for me, as someone who is a second generation South Asian who maybe doesn't have the capability of reading Punjabi, I kind of turn away from some of these books and literature, but I want to learn about the stories and I want to learn about the history. And so your book really offers that access. Why was it so important for you to have the book in English? Was it because of that very reason?
Because of that reason, and because, wanting it to become a teaching tool and a teaching resource. And I think by having it be so visual, with, as I mentioned, with so many, images, and having the content be very digestible. So if you look at the first 40 pages, it is all around historic milestones, and you can just go through the journey of, first to arrive, to, fighting for the right to vote, to Mewa Singh's journey, to the Kamagata-Maru, to, finally being able to establish citizens' rights in Canada. You can see the whole process there, and then you can go into, 32 different pioneer family profiles, which are different from what you may have seen with other books. They're very comprehensive, and they're very much multi-generational stories. So you're going to hear the story of the very first settler and their children who were actually born and raised in Canada. My father-in-law, Sarjit Singh Dosanjh, was born and raised in 1930. So, the knowledge that he has and the colorful detail of growing up as one of the first 5 families in New Westminster, BC. I mean, here I had this treasure trove, this gold mine, just sitting, right at our coffee table. And how could you not ask? How could you not want to learn more about what his experience is? Because it's relevant to everybody that came after. So it was really quite a beautiful journey to be a part of.
Yeah. And with your book, what was the main goal that you wanted to achieve? You talked a lot about having youth understand what their ancestors have went through to build this life. You were just talking about that now, and you've discussed the importance of this history and how it often gets untold. But for you, what was the main goal that you really wanted to achieve with Untold Stories?
I would say inspiring conversations just like this. And I think that is what's come back to me from families is, you know what? We didn't know, this about our own grandparents. And now through this process of, documentation, we're talking about it. And guess what? Our grandkids want to buy copies of this book. And our people who are not even in the book, people outside of the South Asian community want to learn more about the contribution of South Asian peoples. This is not just a South Asian story. These are Canadian stories. And, I think that's fantastic. And if it's not just, South Asian stories, other ethnic minority stories as well. Black Lives Matters has really brought to light, like I said, that gap of culturally relevant content in our classrooms. To me, that is the heart of this project. It has been from the beginning. It will continue to be. And every time a teacher buys a book, I can't tell you. It's, it's like I just know that the content is being valued and it's in the right hands. So, Suki Pangeli and I are really excited about the fall and knowing that this is going to be part of curriculum. I'm already doing lectures. I just did a lecture with Chapman University in California.
Amazing. Wow.
So, the book has now reached the U.S.
Global scale,
it's reached the U.K. It's reached Australia. It is being valued. And, we know that the group of settlers that came here to BC, these were the very first Sikh temple was built here in Vancouver on West 2nd Avenue. That's the first in North America. So, this was a starting point for a lot of families, and many went on to California, or they, went on to the UK. They went on to other places, with this being the first place. So, we've got a rich historical background here, and the living libraries, those elders that I talked about, the precious elders, it's them. They are our knowledge keepers. They are our history keepers, and it felt like a duty to help capture some of that knowledge, while we can. And I think through the COVID lens, we have come to learn how much, even more so, the value of elders in our society, in our community, and how rare and precious they are, and to take time. The greatest gift we can do is to listen to them and to value their journeys.
Absolutely. And just to finish up, for our listeners right now, I'm sure they all want to get out there and purchase a copy. So is the book available? How can people get their hands on it?
Yes, it's available. You can order your copy through www.ojlegacy.com.
Okay.
You can purchase it online, or you can actually go pick up the book from the Oj Media Group location as well, and all of that information is on our website. So we're really excited. The response from the community has been incredibly overwhelming. It's doing really, really well. We're really excited.
Well, what an amazing achievement for you, Karen, and also for the entire community. And it's really preserving Sikh history and the history and stories of all of our ancestors and our families. And I think it's such a beautiful journey that you have embarked on and that you are sharing with the whole community. So thank you so much, Karen, for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. It's my pleasure.